that exists globally that will fit for every single country. Why is that important and why is that true? Because a constitution changes and differs both on time and on place. It differs on the experiences of individuals and how they connect with political events and experiences in their own lives and what they deem to be inalienable rights. For example, 250 years ago, our rights framework existed on a negative basis for the most part. That is, that rights existed in Constitution on the basis that states should not take rights away from people. But these days, the liberal movement and the liberal evolution means that we now acknowledge that human capacity and the very nature of humanity requires that a positive conception of human rights must exist. Now, that's a very large change in what it means to be a constructed inalienable human right, and we acknowledge that societies may want to change it over time. We think that oftentimes, sure.
Status quo measures already allow these particular amendments to the Constitution through referendum, through passing in the legislation. What is the need to actually have a review for each single generation?
I'm literally going to deal with that in about 30 seconds, just let me finish off. So what we think is that it represents supreme law and that it needs to be legitimate because, and I referenced that and flagged that in my introduction, that if the supreme law isn't legitimate, that specifically and necessarily undermines the legitimacy of all other law under that, because for example, if you look at the United States, if a law can be deemed to be unconstitutional, that then is illegitimate and cannot be law itself. So for all law to be legitimate, for all law to exist properly within a country, the supreme law must be necessarily legitimate. We think you have to enforce the review to get that updated. So let me respond to that POI specific positive material now. It's difficult to force change without a forced review for two key mechanisms. Firstly, oftentimes with constitutions, they're entrenched or put in through like supermajorities in legislatures, which typically require something like a 2/3 or 3/4 majority, that necessarily to have that conversation require bilateral support or political parties to come together to change that law. It's problematic in the United States that in order to change some kind of thing around the Second Amendment, even if a majority of Americans wanted that to change, that they would have to sit down and have a discussion with an incredibly toxic political environment that meant that parties didn't want to work together. But even if parties did both acknowledge that they wanted to create change in that law, oftentimes for political reasons, large political parties don't want to work together because they feel like they're ceding ground to other political parties, or they feel like they're undermining their core messages to voters, right? There are political reasons why oftentimes that conversation cannot take place in Congress. But secondly, oftentimes for arbitrary cultural reasons, citizens feel attached to these constitutions because they feel like it represents their national heritage, even though the laws they construct, they don't necessarily feel like represents them. So in the United States, when you get terminology or language around things like the Founding Fathers or the glorious American Revolution against the British invasion, that like clouds over the judgment of people in order to have an objective discussion that can only take place under our model, where a constitutional committee literally provides the law and the cases in law where these inalienable rights have changed the way that this country is governed. That's why you don't get that change without this forced review. What do we achieve, Mr. Speaker? We think that you create better representative law, and that's really valuable because people can connect to their public institutions. That means they're more likely to buy into how their state governs them, right? Because if you feel like your state is failing you because you have who live in South Chicago and there are gun shootings every single day and you want your goddamn legal institutions to deal with the fact that your children are dying, like how do you ever buy into the American Congress as a legitimate being when you can't do anything because a document written 250 years ago on a scrap of paper stops you from protecting your children, right? The problem is that when these laws don't act representatively, people can't meaningfully engage in their law, and they get worse law that doesn't represent the values and the nature of the experiences of individuals. That's harmful. We have to force a change.
I thank the previous speaker for the speech. I'm going to welcome the leader of the opposition here.
Opening government has fatally neglected two realities that govern how the Constitution operates. The first is that constitutions are worded extremely vaguely and generically for good reason, because you want them to apply to a whole host of situations, and because governments generally want to ensure some kind of basic minimum protections for their people. The second reality they ignore is that courts can reinterpret constitutional rights. We saw that recently in the US with Obergefell and Hodge, where like the right to a private life was reinterpreted to grant gays the right to a marriage, right? All of these are fatal to their arguments, which I'll explain for quickly. 3 arguments in opening opposition. First, how this undermines the separation of powers. Second, how this denies minorities good protection and weakens consistency in court rulings. Third, what about imperfect democracies? First, some quick rebuttals. The first thing and the broad claim they make is that sometimes these laws are outdated. The first is that there already exists a mechanism in status quo that's perfectly functional. We already saw this by means of courts reinterpreting, or as CO pointed out in the POI, by means of constitutional amendments. The crucial difference is this: who exactly is in charge of these amendments? We suggest that placing it in the hands of a population who might not have the most benign of intentions is probably the worst idea, because historically speaking, the courts have been the institution that have been the most insulated from populist pressures. It is good that we reserve the power to overturn constitutional laws within a pool of judges who are immune to political pressures, right? So for instance, the right to bear arms, as they told us, might not be relevant in light of gun violence today. Then good, courts can reinterpret that, because as a law student, fortunately I pay attention to this, the original interpretation of the right to bear arms was not to allow everyone to carry a gun. It was to allow particular types of people in areas where there was rampant violence to carry a kind of gun on them. This has been radically expanded, sure, but the courts has simply narrowed that definition once again. No. Secondly, they told us that this conversation can't take place in Congress because of political gridlock. And yes, there's a good reasons why constitutions are hard to change, because this is important. The core value of a constitution comes from the fact that unlike any other court ruling, it is permanent, and its authority comes from the fact that people view it as some kind of moral truth that's persisted over time, right? These are basic intuitive moral truths that lasted through the ages, regardless of what regime is in power, regardless of how the composition of a population is like. And that is uniquely what makes constitutions powerful. They strip constitutions of their power because now governments and populations can easily overturn it or change the terms of it. No, the last thing they told us is that you need people to buy into the legitimacy of the constitution. Sure, and people won't buy into it anymore because now they see it only as a constitution that was valid within that generation, or who only came into being, or which only came into being during that generation. First argument is separation of powers. What exactly is the status quo? That courts are the ones who reinterpret if a certain kind of constitutional right is outdated or understanding of it is outdated. Courts are the ones who reinterpret and redefine, for instance, what it means to have a right to marriage, what it means to have a right to private life. And this is because constitutions are necessarily vague, right? Constitutions can't phrase their rights too narrowly, because then they simply become inapplicable and generally not functional at all. A good instance of this would be Adoran Constructors Incorporation No versus and Penn, in which the court ruled that federal programs classifying races, classifying people by race, would violate the right to equal protection unless there was a compelling government interest involved. So this overturned and shaped our notions of what the right to equal protection came to mean. So the kinds of benefits they talk about happen on our side. It's not mutually exclusive. No. What is the comparative? On their side, they will place this power in the hands of either states or, as I said, referendums in the hands of people to vote on it. 2 problems with this. First, there's a massive conflict of interest. The reason why you have the institutions of the state and the judiciary as generally separate is because that any conflict of interest undermines the ability of the 2 institutions to check against one another. Now the state, which tends to be backed by the majority by means of a referendum, has overwhelming power over an institution and realm in which they are traditionally supposed to keep up on. No, but second, the greater problem with this is that now the constitution becomes extremely volatile. It's not something that persists through the ages, but rather something that depends on the political makeup of the population during that specific time, the kinds of ideologies they hold, whether it's a right-wing government in power, a left-wing government in power, etc., etc. What are the impacts of this? No, twofold. First, we just completely reject this in principle because it's entirely contradictory to what a constitution is meant to be. But second, more pressingly, it diminishes public acceptance of rulings, because when the courts are the ones who reinterpret constitutions, they are seen as more impartial, there's likely to be greater public acceptance. Now when it's something like a constitution is in place because a generation has voted on some kind of review of it, for instance, you're likely to say that, well, this is something we didn't really accept, right? So we should just discard it and rule it as something not very important. No. Second, what about minorities and consistency in court rulings? The first thing we would like to point out is they assume that the population in their case is completely benign. We sort of question this, right? Because In the US, for instance, there's still fairly widespread opposition, like sure, the tide is turning and there's greater public acceptance and momentum for gay rights now. But nonetheless, had it not been for the 5 justices on the US Supreme Court who decided that perhaps granting gays the right to marriage was a good idea, we doubt that public acceptance would have been catalyzed at such a fast rate. The crucial difference is that a lot of the change we saw for minorities came with the courts taking the first step, because they were the ones who reinterpreted the constitutions before the public support then came in. No, what they would have is to have the public decide the terms of the constitution, and therefore this handicaps the ability of courts to effectively promote, closing, for they handicap the ability of courts to promote and spur societal change before it really happens. Yeah.
So if constitutions assuming are necessarily vague, what does that mean for judges who can use their own whims and impose that upon
Yeah,
people?
okay, so it's a comparative, right? Comparatively, judges are more immune from political pressures, and they've been trained to be more neutral than some kind of population who doesn't exactly care about all these things. What exactly is the greater problem? They also reduce the power of legal precedent, where people build on the common basis of what the words state. This is important because people use the trajectory of past rulings to mount legal arguments, and this is how the respect for constitution comes about. On your side, it becomes a bit cloudy, right? Do we respect courts or rulings passed by constitutions which are now no longer enforced? All of which means that, first of all, in terms of courts, you allow courts far greater power to decide what they hold as authoritative and what is not. But second, it's just a lot murkier when people want to uphold their own legal rights under the constitutions in courts. This is bad. Third, on imperfect democracies, there are 2 problems. First, institutions are not accorded proper respect. People think that institutions can be changed willy-nilly, and they precisely acculturize people to that very notion. Even if, and this is the worst case scenario, the constitution is imperfect in imperfect democracies, we think it's better that people actually still believe in it, rather than have people think that the constitution is something that can be permanently removed and changed once every few times, because that is the precise culture that's in place. The second is that the constitution sometimes checks on corrupt leaders, right? We saw this in Ethiopia, where the courts actually held that the president couldn't extend his constitutional term in office. So even in imperfect democracies, constitutionals are a last important vanguard. All these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and I'm happy to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
There's a reason that we decide laws which govern all people in society by democracy. By and large, we trust the people of countries to determine how they govern themselves. Rule by the people is the basis of democracy. You'd be forgiven for not understanding why we don't just give supreme lawmakers, i.e. the courts, people that have been educated, people that are mostly white and mostly male, to just determine all laws, right? What we're doing on our side of the house is simply giving more power to the people to define the most important laws in their country once a generation, which we think is not going to result in the kind of scaremongering that we heard from the other side of the house, and is more likely to result in a good constitutional conversation which keeps the things that are most important to the defining document of a nation up to date with what people actually care about in that point in time. I'm going to do a number of things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why the current mechanisms for change, firstly, don't work to create the sort of changes that we want to enable, but secondly, are worse kinds of changes when they're done through the courts. Secondly, I'm going to explain why we don't have to be concerned about minorities being oppressed by this, and specifically, I'm going to deal with this stuff about corrupt institutions. After that, I'm going to explain why this is essentially not going to make this constitution illegitimate. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about why that constitutional conversation is so important for us to have and why that's a good thing in this debate. Okay, let's deal first with why it wasn't good enough that there was like vague wording and the fact that courts existed, right? Because the point is that you can't like change things wholesale in the same way that you would be able to under our referendum model. You can't just totally get rid of the Second Amendment, for instance, because you decide protection of gun rights is not something that you want to do in your country, right? You can only reinterpret that in ways by like twisting the language in often ways that are like seen as illegitimate by the people. Where like you put like strained interpretations on words that obviously don't mean that thing, in which people like Scalia complain about all the time in the court. You get opposition to that, and often you don't even get those changes at all until there's massive support behind them. They often come far too late. Look, for example, at the fact that the United States of America was one of the later countries to change and legalize gay marriage through their court system as a result of the fact that the judges are essentially appointed by the political institutions. The president, who is a bipartisan individual in that system, gets to appoint the people who are on that court. So we think they're a terrible mechanism for achieving that sort of change. We also gave you reasons which they didn't respond to about why things like referendums and like the supermajority wouldn't be used. Mostly to do with the fact that you need that massive amount of support, but also there's a massive culture around it that never got a response from them. So why do we prefer that this is done through the people rather than through the courts? Because they had this strange point about how this undermines the separation of powers. If it's like the people were some like branch of government, right? That's clearly like not the case. The people aren't a branch of government. And we're happy to say that ultimately everything that all the branches of government do is for the people. Giving people directly power through referendums is not going to undermine the role the courts have. We're simply saying this role should have been with the people all along in the first place. And we're happy to say that they're better at doing that than the courts for a number of reasons. The reason is that they represent the interests of all the people within that society. Everyone's got the option to say what it is that's important to them, rather than it being decided by like an old white dude who happened to be like appointed by the president of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. We say that's a terribly undemocratic way to determine the most important thing in your country, and that is the Constitution. All right. Let's deal now with the second point in this debate about why we didn't need to worry about minorities being oppressed. Because like this was essentially a scapegoat of our argument, right? Like the Constitutional Review Commission is not going to allow people to simply like, you know, get rid of really important clauses and replace them with like really crazy things. They're going to look into what kinds of issues like sensible people in society actually care about. Things like, for example, the like free speech amendment and like the one about the guns, the Second Amendment in the United States. The things that people are likely to want to make constitutional changes about. They'll do a review, they'll look into the history of it, they'll propose reasonable alternatives that people who've studied this kind of thing and people that have like reviewed the court cases and the literature think are viable alternatives. They'll present those things to the public, they'll explain to the public in a very nice way, like we often see in the sort of referendums that happen around the world when the Constitution is being looked at, what these changes mean, what the different arguments are for and against each various thing, and then people will decide. And by and large, we trust people to be relatively good, right? Like this idea that people just want to like screw over the little guy is just terrible, right? Most of the people that go out and vote in these things, when their like voter turnout isn't like, you know, 100% anyway, are the people that actually care, the people that care about the Constitution embodying the spirit of that nation, right? They're not the evil haters who want to go over and like screw the minority groups, right? That's just not the way these things work in reality. I'll take closing.
You still lock them out from accessing change because you might not have enough political movement at that time when you're actually doing this particular review. But on our side, at least it's still flexible. When you look at gay rights, when they can still access
Okay, so we're not getting rid of the courts. Like the courts will still be there to interpret the like change legislation afterwards, right? What we're just saying is adding an extra mechanism to totally get rid of new clauses or like add new ones in or whatever that happens to be. Let's look now at corrupt institutions really quickly because this was silly, right? If you're in a corrupt government, often cronies are appointed to the courts, so you've actually given more power to that corrupt institution to decide what the laws are instead of the people. That didn't really stand in this debate. Alright, why will it not be less legitimate under our model? Because this kind of assumed, like against what was explained by the Prime Minister in this debate, that constitutions are some kind of objective, like natural law thing that's always existed and is always true. It's context dependent, Madam Speaker. That's like the case in all countries. Look at Japan, who as part of its constitution has pacifism enshrined. Look at Germany, who puts dignity as the first thing in the constitution, unlike any other country, because of essentially war guilt reasons to do with World War II. Look at the United States, who has the gun rights in there simply because of the context of the American Revolution and British people taking their guns off them. All of it's based on the needs of a society at a particular point in history, and all we're doing is simply bringing that point in history to the present day, to the people that are most affected by that within that 25-year span. We're not likely to see this wholesale change where you just chuck out everything in the Constitution. Things like inalienable rights, things like the right to like assemble in public and that kind of thing are probably not going to be changed. Those things are probably going to stay because people generally like those sort of things. You're probably not going to have this massive volatile like mess that they wanted to talk about on their side of the house, right? You're probably just going to have little small changes that actually reflect the will of the people that want to change those things. It's also not going to be dependent on like political climate. That was really strange because it's being done by referendum, not being done through Congress. All right, very briefly, let's talk about this constitutional conversation. I've already covered most of this throughout the speech, but the key point here is that you need to talk about it so that people feel that they have some degree of control, right? When people say that like free speech is an important right in America and others disagree about that, that means a conversation needs to be had. When like racial minorities feel that hate speech is a terrible thing which afflicts them, but is like essentially not like dealt with properly in that country because of the rights in the Constitution to do with free speech, we say that's a conversation that those groups need to have. And if they don't have the ability to make that change, for all the reasons we've explained in this debate, they feel disempowered. They feel like their country no longer represents them, and the legal system and government which rules over them is illegitimate. We want to empower those people in this debate. We want to make sure everyone has a stake in the democracy. Give power back to the people.
I thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech, and I'm happy to work with the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Madam Speaker, the opening government team tried to sort of pull the wool over your eyes by just kind of asserting that the Commission and the ways in which any amendments or any changes, repealing or upholding these things, we've done in a wonderfully lovely, impartial manner that would be completely immune to any kind of capture from governments. That the population would vote with perfect information, knowing, you know, from time immemorial, the specific changes of little words to the Constitution would bring forevermore, and indeed would not be open to any kind of biases, be they temporal, be they political, be they whatever. This is a problem. So, four things in the speech. Firstly, the problem with his commission stuff. Secondly, the specific problem with the model they've set up and why it will always be a problem when you have to appeal or not repeal or uphold or whatever the Constitution through referenda every, 25 years. Next, why we think there is a utility to an enduring Constitution. And finally, why this sense of veneration of a Constitution as being broadly immutable, as being very difficult to change, has specific utility in the developing world and other places. So firstly, quickly then, the rebuttal is interwoven, as you will come to understand. So, firstly, on the Commission stuff, he says, look, we'll have this magic impartial chair, which will, see the will of the people and say, no, clearly the people want or are thinking very much about Article 5 of the US Constitution, so we will propose that this is something that they might be thinking about. A couple of problems with this. Firstly, the motion requires you to defend, any kind of change going through. We say that this is a problem. Why? Because obviously there are implicit biases in which things this Commission thinks that people want to care about. Indeed, it is only, there are temporal biases as to what things people care about. There are biases in terms of how this Constitution, how this body will interpret what it is that people care about. And also, it's still giving people a false choice, right? If your choice is either uphold, repeal, or, have this particular interpretation that the impartial Commission has said that you should have, then that seems a problem. The second thing is, you have to re-up every single clause of the Constitution, right? This is the second thing I want to talk about. This is really problematic. Why? Because at its best, we can say, okay, maybe the US Constitution can be summarised as, repeal, change, or whatever, the 7 articles and 27 amendments. That's still quite a lot to get the electorate to look through and say, okay, here's this massive long document about whether you want to re-up or agree with every single article, amendment, etc. in the Constitution, or whether you want to change it. We think that people are particularly open and very easy to be persuaded that, oh no, you should just change this one little thing here because we think it's really important. The importance of this will become clear shortly, because constitutions, and this is why it's really important, right? Firstly, Finally, it's impossible to get a genuine conversation or a ratification or an alteration of every single word in a constitution. The US Constitution is thousands of words long, and importantly, Supreme Court cases will be decided on the specific interpretation of one or two single words or single phrases. What this means is it's incredibly easy under their side of the house for governments, through capture of the regulation or through, specifically telling people, oh, you should definitely vote yes in the referendum for clause 35 because it's really important, to pull the wool over eyes by getting people to focus on one change in this giant referendum they'll have to vote on, or not others, which means it's easy for governments to get through changes on things that may seem very minor at the time, but over a long period of time will actually be incredibly important. Secondly, people just don't have a reason to buy in and inform themselves about this referendum. It's not like in Ireland where you have, one sentence, yes or no, once in a lifetime. It's suddenly every 25 years the constitution gets changed. You have to vote on every single thing. You've got different sides telling you yes for this thing, no for that thing. People just get tired and don't afford this to proper scrutiny that deserves, and that's something that the courts do. The reality is it just becomes very easy for governments to try and co-opt this process, to try and use their own political leverage and political reasons to insert particular clauses into things. And it's just really problematic, because if you just change one or two words in the US Constitution, it is those things can be done really easily. As X tells you, right, it is actually the reason why gay marriage is held to be legal in the US is a specific interpretation of a privacy clause. It would be very easy for a Republican government to suggest that we should change that privacy clause just by one or two words, without the electorate really understanding what it is they're voting for, or removing protections and say, oh, we don't need these protections anymore, without understanding the constitutional law that underpins, and without understanding the kind of freedoms that they might be taking away from people. So, why is it really important that a constitution is enduring? Because it sets the limits of the state, and it sets the limit of the government. It is not designed to be altered regularly. That is already the province of the legal executive. That is already the province of the government passing its laws. It is, by nature, a curb on governments from actively doing terrible things. Importantly, if I pass a law and it's bad, it's fairly easy for it to be repealed. If I change the constitution in a way that makes the lives worse of huge numbers of people, it's very difficult to change that going into the future, even with this mechanism, because of the safeguards that they themselves want to go in. Not least because the problems often don't become apparent for 20 or 30 years down the line. So let's take the POI from CG. They say, no. The problem with constitutions being vague and protecting minorities is that it means it's very open to judges just, interpreting them in the winds that they want, or interpreting them in problematic ways. We say a couple of things. Firstly, a body of interpretation of constitutions builds up over time. That is why the US Constitution has, with its 200-year history, or the San Marino Constitution, because it's the oldest one with its 250-year history, means that there is fairly consistent interpretation. Note, it's much easier to get the problems they talk about when the Constitution changes every 25 years. When suddenly the Constitution changes, or a few words change, and that's all it takes to undermine a huge amount of constitutional law, suddenly it's much easier for judges to just interpret it in the way they want to. Secondly, we just say that courts are more rigorous in the ways in which they interpret law and the standards that they hold themselves to than the politicians, or indeed a general and vote referendum weary population. Thirdly, courts just in general, right, are really progressive when you compare them to the population. We look at the treatment of women in America, of African Americans in America, of gay people in America, and we note that the pioneering body that has pushed through rights in every instance has been the Supreme Court, who said that what you are doing to these people is unconstitutional. No, thank you. Right? So, next, we say this is obviously better than just having a referendum every 25 years. Go.
Yep, the population was never afforded an opportunity to change gay marriage, despite supporting it for the last decade and a half. Why is it better in your world that we have to wait for conservative justices appointed by George Bush to get the change that the people want?
Right, firstly, we just don't think that's true in many cases. We say if a referendum had been passed 20 years ago, in fact, if this policy had been passed, say, importantly, 50 years ago, right, we very much suspect that a Republican government, or even a Democrat government 50 or 60 years ago, might have put in a clause that says we define marriage as being one man and one woman. Because the difference is, it's unclear, right, how these things will change over time, and it's only very rapidly in the last 10 or 15 years that we've seen these kind of acceptances come to fore. And actually, a legalization of gay marriage, there are already Republican senators who support an amendment to the Constitution changing these things. We think it'll be very difficult to get through. So, next, in developing countries, we say that a veneration and a stability of the Constitution is sacrosanct in ensuring that these countries progress, right? Why? Because firstly, often these countries just if they've recently come out of conflict, if they've recently come out of civil war, already don't or lack the respect for institutions. They lack the respect for courts or for governments. When we say that the Constitution is something that is sacrosanct, that isn't just seen to be easily captured by the government to just change and interpret what they want, when the rulings of the court are seen to be robust, that's when we get stability, that's when we get growth, that's when we get the protection of minorities. Ultimately, we win this debate. For all of those reasons, we oppose.
I thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, for those remarks, and I'm happy to welcome the member of
It's unclear why opening opposition thinks that courts always act in liberal ways. We believe this has not always historically been the case, because courts are generally people who are quite old in that generation, right? So we see, like, for example, in the United States, the Supreme Court has not always been progressive. They have told runaway slaves that they were not allowed to live in the North, where slavery was illegal, right? We think that courts are not always necessarily progressive, but we trust that the people within that country are able to make decisions about what values they want to uphold, because that's ultimately what constitutions are. They're about the guiding values of how we treat other humans within our society. That is why countries like South Africa, when they had the opportunity to rewrite their constitution at the end of apartheid, did things like include human dignity as a value that they want to guide going forward. And that has dramatically changed the way that things like, for example, squatters' rights are treated there, because they recognize the human dignity of human beings in that country to need to create a home in a world that is incredibly unequal, where it is difficult for those people to access land to be able to do that. So first, I'm going to do some refutation of the case that's brought for us from opening opposition, and then I'm going to extend about legal jurisprudence, right? What's important to note is that there's a limited ability to interpret constitutions because of originalism, right? You still always are, you're a slave to those words, right? Like, those words are always what you have to go back to. We had to find the two words in that privacy clause that allowed the Supreme Court to legalize gay marriage, right? Because there's not political will to do so in Congress. But we think that largely if you held a referendum across the entire United States, you would get that upheld, right? So we think that what's important is that, and this originalism is to the creators, right? What do the creators think? And what this sunset clause allows us to do is every 25 years there are new creators that judges are now like need to follow, right? And that's what's particularly important about sunset clauses. So let's talk about this temporal bias, right? So in the comparative, what we need to do is if we're waiting for Supreme Court justices to be more progressive, is we need to wait for something particularly egregious to happen to a minority group or someone who needs to be protected, and then have that go all the way through the Supreme Court, right? But every 25 years, we are able to reevaluate clauses in our Constitution. Then what we're able to do is not have to necessarily wait for those egregious things to happen to people, right? And yes, it's every single clause, because every single clause is particularly important. This side of the House gives absolutely no agency for people to value the way that their country exists, right? Like, they just assume that people won't care. I think that people do take different elections seriously. It's the same way that people take presidential elections slightly more seriously than they take other elections, right? Like, human beings have the capability to reason and understand, even if they're not attending this debate tournament, for example. There are lots of smart people who choose not to debate, right? There are lots of smart people who choose to instead, I don't know, spend their time figuring out how they want to vote in these referendums. So I think what we need to think about that is, like, for example, African Americans largely don't vote in state elections because they feel like the state doesn't care about them. But if they were voting for a new constitution, they probably want to vote in that election, right? So I think that the kinds of people you get coming out to elections will necessarily be different. This side of the House assumes government control, right? They assume that the government will always be able to control the dialogue about which clauses will and won't be put forward, right? And I just don't believe that that is the case. So I think that, and they say, like, oh, like, sometimes it takes a while for us to see what the consequences of our decisions are. Yes, and then we have 25 years where we can choose to change them. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is my extension. I think what we need to recognize is this is a comparative debate about how we actually get change in the law, in the guiding documents of our Constitution, right? So it's fine if we want to add things in legislation, right? So if you want to add legislative protectives for gay individuals, for example, in the legislature, that's fine. But what we're talking about is, how do you fundamentally change the document that guides our society, right? So that's done in two ways, either by interpretation through constitutional courts or through political majority. No, thank you. So we think that Largely, judges interpret constitutions in two schools, either through conservatism, which means they look for the original meaning, right? Or through liberalism, who are often seen as overstepping their bounds in our society, right? So when we look to originalism, for example, we think of someone like Anthony Scalia, right? And the conservative bloc on the United States Supreme Court, right? So an example of how they would interpret particular rulings is Scalia wants to overturn Roe v. Wade because he thinks that the founding fathers wouldn't have wanted it that way, right? So he goes back to the original people who wrote the Constitution because it's their intention that matters to him because he's supposed to be interpreting that document that they wrote, right? So, but however, if we have the people who are writing that Anthony Scalia's philosophy would change, I would think, to a certain extent, if he is upholding to new creators, right? And those new creators are the people who are voting in these referendums every 25 years, right? We think that in a lot of cases, they're not, like, constitutions aren't worded vaguely, right? They're often worded quite explicitly in a lot of cases, which is what makes them difficult to interpret, right? To get the things that we want out of them, right? And that's the demonstration of this constraint, right? Like, currently we have to interpret them to get out what we want of them. I'll take opening.
Courts are not perfect, but they supported desegregation, abortion rights, etc. before population. So even if judges are old, the people who vote in your referendums are the most vocal opponents of, say, abortion rights or gay marriage. That's why the potential for harm is so
Yes, the most vocal opponents and proponents, right? So we think what we have is actually a dialogue about what we want in our society, right? You can't just slam the negative all the time. Like, I agree that people in the United States sometimes will vote against abortion. That will happen, but there are also people who will vote for it, right? And that's how referendums decide whether or not these things are good. Because we think ultimately the people who have to live with these laws are the people who are in this country, right? So those are the people who are affected by these laws, and currently what's occurring is political dialogue in government, and the philosophy of, like, legal jurisprudence is what's controlling the way that people in that society feel, right? And the way that people in that society interact with that, right? So when we think about, and just think about the average age of someone on the Supreme Court. They're 63 years old. So, if you think about the average age of human beings in the United States, it is much lower than 63 years old, right? So you have 63-year-olds deciding about the human dignity of people who are 25, right? I think that people who are 25 want an opportunity to be able to define the way that their society works, right? So even if they don't change anything, even if these referendums uphold the same constitution year after year after year, you get more buy-in from people in society because they feel like they're part of that country because they've had an opportunity to participate in the founding document, in the founding values of what that society is, right? So on their side of the house, their comparative, they are constrained by what old white men who write these documents are, right? We think often when we think about the inceptions of constitutions, they're often not at the most politically good time in all cases, right? So what we would rather do is put them in a contemporary context always and give the people the ability to choose what is important to them.
I don't remember. Government has that speech, and I'm happy to welcome the member of the opposition here.
May I begin? Yes. So, as the closing opposition, I have a few contextualization that I would like to make, which is quite ironic. Because first of all, we want to talk about what really state is. Because state is, first of all, a continuum institution, which you can't simply cut up into different pieces and divide them into different generations. Because the past builds onto the present, and present builds onto the future. And when you delegitimize the past legislation or the constitution by changing it every certain regular time, then we think then your own current legitimacy also falls under your side. And the second thing we want to talk about is basically constitution. Why do we have constitution in the first place? Because we think constitution is, first of all, it's a fundamental basic guidelines of a state and that creates an identity for them. But the second of all, the real reason why we have such a permanent concept of constitution is because it's about setting the limitation. It's perfecting the democracy's biggest flaw of the whim of the majority. Because under their case, there's no check and balance system whatsoever that will counterbalance whatever harms that will be derived from the fact that simply majority wanted it, then therefore that must be intuitively right, which we think is obviously wrong. Because we are going to tell you, basically, we're going to prefer a direction that was designed to be permanent at the point of design, rather than a direction that was designed to be changed whenever it needs to, in next 25 years, because that completely goes against, first of all, the flexibility of the flexibility and better representation of the minority that we want to protect at the end of the day. And the second of all, give like less legitimacy to the overall like the constitution and the government as a whole. But before I move on to my extension, let me move on to basically like the argumentation of the entire government side. Because the opening government basically tells us that let's give power back to the people because they make the best decision. They say let's trust people's goodwill upon these issues of minority, which is very funny because they simply assume that people will make all this goodwill and take the bad stuff out and keep the nice stuff. But we have certain problems with it because first of all, people are not necessarily always nice. As we can see, people does make sometimes stupid decisions on the majority level, can be seen from like people like voting for like Donald Trump. But second of all, even if people are really nice people and have goodwill, then why do we have constitution in the first place when people can make the right decisions all the time? The reason why we have constitution is because people don't make right choices all the time, right? Because we think ethics are not just simply crafted by like majority's whim that can throw a vote at certain times. Because we think there are absolute values even if the majority side says otherwise. Because under their house, they now have to like legitimize how like if the majority are against giving rights to LGBT or actually for slavery, then like how would they justify this kind of thing simply because majority are for it, because that is what's happening, right? And then we say, of course, like if the majority is good, then we have no problem, everyone will be happy. But then exactly, like the purpose of laws and constitution is the cases when people don't want to be nice to people, which is the majority time when it's between majority versus minority, right? Because the majority can always like have this influence, and we believe constitution are the last standing ground that we can provide to the minorities and better protect them. And then like the closing comes and says that, well, like we think like court can be like, it's going to be conservative because it's ruled by like white old men, and like public is liberal, so therefore we give power to the public. But then, like, we think it's on a like comparative level, because we think there can be also cases when the court is liberal but the public is conservative. But under our side, we at least have the accountability because we can hold these minor, like old white men that we can identify clearly. We can't make the public accountable for certain decisions when the majority already are in that direction, right? And the second part is that, well, they can like change the document, change upon either the interpretation or the actual changes of the document. But then we think we are creating like this burden of change on the movement rather than like protecting them by the state. You're saying that we cannot protect your minority value unless you actively arise upon against it and like try and make your efforts to like win over the majority and win the constitution and change the constitution for your benefit. We think it is actually like the reason why we have state is to actually protect these minorities without the minorities having to protect themselves, right? And under this alright, lines of refutals, let me move on to our unique extensions that will contribute to the broader debate. But before I move on, opening.
We never actually said that we just wanted progressive change. We were in fact happy to trust the people to choose their values for themselves. But if you did want that change, the courts can still actually interpret this new constitution. All you've done is remove an option for the people to have influence over what that constitution is. Why is that a good change?
Because we believe that it's going to give better legitimacy. Because we told you which are you going to trust more in with a design that was designed to be permanent. Because we think basically how do we better adhere to the minorities better and have like this flexible representation. Because we think under their case there's no flexibility allowed, because then you just simply change the constitution every 25 years, and what about those changes that is needed within that 25 years? We think also, like when you talk about this interpretation now not becoming possible, we think there's external influences in coming into formation of the identities of the people. And we think because the issue of accountability is never can be addressed under their cases, we believe that we actually cater to the changes that is needed. Because at the end of the day, it's about like giving the appropriate legitimacy to the government and the constitution. Because we're forcing the needs to the change to the society rather than the society like needing or wanting it. So every 25 years, you're forcing the society to undergo a certain change that maybe they're not actually ready for, but is needed. Basically, so what this harm does is that it is not, maybe there are not enough political capital accumulated yet, but they're like shunned because at that time of the time, you need to make the constitution, and once that constitution is made, then you have to wait another 25 years. The problem we have with this is basically then it becomes like a political deadlock and a time fight, like the budget council, where like the government is shut down and you hold the government hostage because if you don't let me do this, then I'm going to you have to wait another 25 5 years to achieve what you want to do. And when there are already radical majority, sometimes that are oppressing the minority, we think there are problems that follows. But then we think change is needed because the risk that will extend from the generation. Like, why do you put the risk of every generation of putting this wrong, maybe like unethical constitution to every generation? Because we're not banning entire change of constitution itself. What we're doing is you can change it if it must be changed, but we still have that permanency that needs to be adhered to because we want to minimize whatever risk that will be faced the hardest hit by the minorities that we want to protect the most at the end of the day. We also say that previous government as a whole is delegitimized by pitting the intergeneration conflicts because us under your case, the generation, the majority is there are also going to be these conservative forces and you can't cut up certain generation to the next generation. And because this entire legitimacy is you're pitting against this generation against each other, we believe that it is not something we can flip and change, and because we want more political influences and more representation and basically better protection of the people from themselves, we're very proud to oppose.
The previous speaker for those remarks, and I'm happy to welcome the whip speaker in opposition.
The alternative the opposition literally hung their debate on is the capacity for judges in order to interpret constitutions. Our extension tells you explicitly that judges do not have free rein in order to interpret constitutions when they are constrained to not use their own ethical value system, because how we evaluate the legitimacy of constitutions currently is by originalism, by what the intention of that constitution was, the very permanence and archaic idea that the value system of that constitution is unchanging, unyielding, and resolute. The reality then is that the explicit constraints and that what empowers conservative judges within Supreme Courts and constitutional courts is to say, you cannot impose your liberal modern ideologies upon us. You cannot reinterpret this constitution in this way. So if we want a mechanism of judicial reinterpretation, we've empowered liberal judges by giving them a rationale in order to back up that the people are the ultimate source of the legitimacy of that constitution, and that allows for rigorous reinterpretation in the intention of the people. No response. Let's talk about broadening value systems, because the government opposition bench has really conflated what is constitutional and what is legal. So we're not saying that people should have referenda on all laws, because things which govern individual relations for minority groups, rights for women, etc., gay marriage, are far more on the legal spectrum of things when they concede that constitutions govern universal principles. So to say in your constitution only straight people are entitled to rights in terms of marriage is not a constitutional declaration, because it doesn't apply universally to that group of people. The reality of what needs to be in a constitution are the vague concepts of human dignity and life that they've conceded to. So if the reality is about legislative change to oppress minority groups, we do not give the people that mechanism in order to create new legislature. We create founding ethical universal beliefs for that group of people that aren't as rigorous. Because if someone wants to deny a person gay the right to marriage, we believe they have to deny it to themselves. If they want to victimize a group of people by their constitution, they have to deny that they also have human dignity. And that's quite a significant check and balance because under our side of the house. But let's do a comparison, because the second question is, who is more conservative? Because neither side of the house is advocating for a completely liberal institution to take up some form of philosopher king role. The reality is that we're dealing with judges who are appointed by the executive, and that's what they've never acknowledged, that there are significant political influences over judges when they are appointed by the president of their country, by a vetting process by political parties, and are often beholden to that political party in the long term. The reality is that their intuitions of that political party often spill over into the justice that they have. So Republican political parties are far more likely to appoint conservative judges. The second thing is that these judges are there for a life term. The reality is that they are unstatic, and their mechanism of change is we have to wait for them to die in order to create greater transitive change. But more importantly, it's that these judges aren't impartial from their own beliefs. There's a reason that it's called the Catholic conservative bloc in the United States Supreme Court, precisely because the potential for individual personal morals are being influenced when the interpretation of the initial constitution was similarly Christian. The reality is that the bloc led by Antonin Scalia is particularly subjective in the way it engages with this. But the comparative is of the public, who's more likely to be naturally skeptical of the government. We don't buy the contextualization that the people are going to be influenced and manipulated by the government when they're the ones who every 5 years change their government and are particularly willing to do so where their government fails them. The reality is that the people are particularly robust as to what core values that they would like to institute within their country. So how do we best respond then to closing opposition's extension about public attitude to constitutionalism? Because we believe that legitimacy doesn't come from permanence. That's why people don't like dictatorships. If on their side of the house permanence is what is desirable by people, people would love dictatorships a lot more than they do democracy, because democracy seems to change rather often. What gives legitimacy and buy-in from the people is the fact that things are of their consent, are validated and accepted by them. And we think that that's exactly when you gain significant buy-in, not when people see an old archaic law and constitution that they never consented to and can never identify with. And if they want to talk about legitimacy of the state, without an unvalidated social contract, it's unclear why the state has any more legitimacy under their side of the house when we have continued reinforced consent under our side of the house to continually legitimize the process of laws that are governed by that state. We don't think people, no thank you ma'am, people will get bored as opening opposition tells us, oh, we can't read lists and we can't be bothered to learn about things. That's an argument against democracy itself. I mean, political manifestos are kind of complicated and we expect quite a lot of voters in order to understand the broad range of choices that they're offered. A lot of opening opposition was effectively an anti-democratic rant about how idiotic the population is, and we don't believe that's significant enough when we trust them to govern the legislature and the executive of their own countries. We believe we can trust them to create the founding principles that are universal to that group of people and that they themselves would want to benefit from because it's in their self-interest. I'll take opening now.
The only kinds of changes that people will vote for are those that are specifically worded. For instance, only straight people can marry. Because if the change is from vague to vague, they can't see the difference, and at the same time, they don't feel like they have to stick to the constitution.
See, we've given you a reason that some countries, out of wars, etc., have a constitutions which are particularly binding. So lots of countries enshrine life as the exclusive mandate of their state, the exclusive value. But countries which emerged later enshrined human dignity, and that's why we get equitable marriage and justification for it. That's why we can protect against abortion rights. That's why we can provide redistribution. And where constitutions are trapped with archaic ranked value systems like life is supreme, etc., we can see changes in the priorities of different rights that are not just about wording. We can change the priorities and hierarchies of people's desires, and we think that's incredibly important. What is it then that we've told you lastly about legal jurisprudence? So I'll concede that this is particularly nuanced, right? It's that the capacity to legitimize constitutions comes from their original document. To say that this constitution emerged out of a particular group of people who legitimized it. Therefore, the interpreters of that constitution must appeal to the intentions of those who legitimized it. And what we do is we empower a liberal bloc who's able to interpret the common values of the people that exist currently. We allow for reinterpretation because we don't have to rely on a privacy clause to get gay marriage into the public sphere when we can interpret things like human dignity, impose different values on the concept of marriage, and we are free from the shackles of originalism that archaic individuals impose upon our constitution when we allow for the potential for true reinterpretation. Thank you very much.
Those remarks, and I'm happy to welcome the opposition with here.
We gave you two very important things from closing opposition that was never really dealt in depth coming from closing government, right? But even through the POIs towards opening government. It was basically this. Number one, constitutions enshrine the idea of a state. What are those implications? Number one, that the present generation does not have the right to determine this particular idea when my member has clearly told you that the idea of a state is a continuum in and of itself. But secondly, we also think it's very good, therefore, when it's permanent and it's very difficult to change exactly because
because of the idea of the constitution that enshrines these particular values, right? Something that we think largely the closing government especially conceded to. But secondly, it's also comparative on where and who can we hold accountable for problematic policies that shut out minority groups at the end of the day. Because we tell you there's a large difference, right? In the case of the comparative is, at least when you have progressive societies and non-progressive courts, right, at least you can hold them accountable to a certain extent. You can hold these executives accountable, right? But when you have a non-progressive society and progressive courts, where do you hold who accountable when, as you said, it's the majority that gets to decide this particular value of a state, right? So number one question is, what is a constitution, what is legitimate, and should it remain permanent, right? Because we deny this entire characterization of our case as being like, if you want permanency, you should turn to dictatorship, right? Because they've largely conceded to the fact that permanency in values is particularly a good thing, especially with examples of like Japan and like pacifism and like Germany, and the fact that they talk about freedom of speech, like democratic ideas. These are all permanent values that we think are very important, right? So what are these particular values that dictators say? Number one, we already told you that state values are a particular continuum. No, thank you. The state values are a particular continuum, right? The existence of a state as a political institution is a continuum that does not depend on particular generations in and of itself, right? As in the previous generation does not get to dictate what this state really means and how this state was particular founded. How do we see this? Number one, in the ways that states actually create identities with these people. Me identifying maybe as a Korean person does not depend on my circumstance at this particular moment of how we see Korea, but it depends on an entire history of which is accumulated within the values enshrined within the constitution, right? But secondly, these values are also handed down in multiple other ways. Example in policies, example in education. When in Japan you actually like try to teach children pacifism is a good thing because we did terrible war crimes during World War II, right? We think this is all a continuum that we need to enshrine, right? Therefore, these values must remain a particular cornerstone and permanently and should be valued. But when is it problematic when you allow which values based on number one, the public, but number two, especially the generation, right? Because number one, when you look at public, it is highly dependent on what the public feels today, right? Like as the opening government characterized, opening government literally tells you that people want change, but at the same time, people have some sort of cultural sentimentalism towards these particular constitutions, right? We think in that case, you already nullify your change because these people are never likely to vote for a different constitution, right? But we think that's perfectly old, right? In the case that they don't do so. Why is that? Because number one, we think you play into maybe problematic political atmosphere of today. Example, if you think xenophobia is a big thing against Syrian refugees today, that plays into that particular sentiment at that point in time, right? But secondly, we already told you progressive groups may not have enough political momentum at that particular time, and you lock them out from accessing change, right? Because the comparative here is who is more important if there are contrasting decisions. On your side, you still need to defend the referendum and the will of the people. At least on our side, we have accessible, accountable courts that are able to take the fall for this, right? We think it's not flexible. For example, LGBT movements and like the suffragette movements, these are dependent on certain circumstances that shape these particular political movements to gain political capital, but now you shut them out from accessing this particular change. No, thank you. But secondly, why do we think a generation does not have the right to craft this particular idea, right? Because number one, we think that the difference between generations that no one really has talked about except for us in today's debate is the fact that number one, there are certain cultural nuances that are different from each generation, but more importantly, because there's shifting dynamics of how you see a particular environment, right? We think this is problematic when you allow the value of your circumstances at this point in time to be a lot more important than previous generational circumstances and how they've crafted these particular ideas, because essentially you're saying what the majority feels today out of their generational capacity is a lot more valuable, right? We think this is incredibly problematic. As I've already given you examples and conceded to what OG said, pacifism is a good thing. It's a significant value because it has a historical implication that is embedded within the constitution but should not change just because you think North Korea is going to attack you today and therefore your circumstance of your generation is a lot more important, right? We think that values are not representative of what an idea of a state is because representation plays into the legislative system, not necessarily the constitution that enshrines the values behind it, right? But before I move on to the second question, closing.
So how can you ever legalize abortion when you can never prioritize and change the ranking of dignity in life? Because that's the justification for why the life of the fetus is less important than the dignity of the mother.
Okay, I'm going to address this right now, right? What is the better change? Because we told you from our member, which was not responded to, that the role of constitution is to protect democracy. Again, its biggest failure, which is the rule of the majority, right? In the case that number one, you uphold certain values, but it makes it incredibly difficult to change the thing. The comparative here is this, right? The bias exists on both sides. On
both sides, you have potential of white old men that dominate the population, right? In the case of maybe referendums, in the case of maybe like the court system itself, right? The question is, who can we hold accountable to create these protection mechanisms, right? The problem over here is when you allow the public to have this, you create additional burdens on social movements that already have the burden of creating political capital in order to access that particular change, because you need to now convince the population that you are relevant, that you are important, right? We think that's incredibly problematic when that protection needs to be guaranteed by the state. But secondly, we also think that the bias that you have in the public is a lot more entrenched, a lot more extreme, right? Because exactly as closing government tells you, what these court systems do is that they have to reinterpret, that they need to interpret these particular things. We think that that gives you at least a check against that particular bias that you might have, because they talk about originality, right? But how did we ever manage to pass constitutional amendment that granted rights to women, that granted rights to African Americans, right? It wasn't looking at the original clause that was white people matter, but the original clause that universal suffragette matters to people who we think are important in society. That is what originality means, not pinpointing a certain type of minority, right? So we think that's irrelevant coming from closing government, right? Because when they talk about human dignity itself, you can leave it unchanged within your constitution, but leave it up to the legislature to change certain policies, right? Because we think their idea of interpretation is exactly what stops judges from being extremely biased, as opposed to the public, which has these entrenched bias from the minute that they were born because of the way they were socialized, right? We think that this allows people to utilize nuances of these particular laws through interpretation, as we saw in LGBT rights, in contrast to the public that does not understand these nuances at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, it's a comparative. If both sides have biases, right? If both sides agree that constitutions are very important for the idea of the state, do we give the present generation the right to decide what is good for the idea of the state? Do we give the present generation any sort of accountability measure to protect the minority? We don't think so. Thank you.
Crossover, shake hands, we'll call you in.